it's Mrs. Salloway again, and I'm coming on today to do you an assembly about another Bible story, and it's called David and Goliath. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this story, but it's about one of my favourite characters in the Bible, and his name is David. And David, I'll just give you a little backstory about David. He was the youngest of a lot of brothers, and he was a shepherd. So he used to go out into the fields looking after sheep, and by looking after the sheep sometimes he used to come across bears and maybe even the odd lion. You know, wild animals would come and threaten the sheep, and he had to learn as a shepherd to fight off threats, you know, to the sheep, because he didn't want the sheep to die. So he used to have to fight them off with just simple things like stones. So he used to use something called a sling, and he used to swing the sling like this, put the stone in, and he used to shoot it at some of the animals to scare them away or to get rid of them so that the sheep would be protected. So he was quite brave, really. You wouldn't think it really as a shepherd. You don't really think of a shepherd, do you, as being a warrior? But he was a very brave and very courageous man. But also, David, the reason why Mrs. Salloway likes David is because he was actually a musician as well. And he played the harp. And he wrote a book in the Bible called Psalms. And Psalms are almost a little bit like poems and songs. He wrote loads and loads of those. And in those days, harps would have been made out of, you know, simple wood. Maybe it would have been made of reeds, strings, and even animal, you know, different parts of animals may have been used to make the strings. And they could either be very simple harps, or, you know, there were more, depending on who had made them. You know, you could have a couple of strings on the harp, or you could have many strings. So, you know, that's a little bit of a backstory about David. But also, the story before David and Goliath talks about how out of all his brothers, they were looking for a new king. And all his other brothers looked so much stronger, so much more fitting. But God hadn't chosen any of his brothers. God had chosen David, actually. And they found out that David was going to be the next king. So David had already been anointed king, actually, when we go into this story about David and Goliath. But he didn't know. The other people around him, other than his family, didn't really know that David was going to be the next king. But, and it didn't happen until years into his future. He had to wait a long time to become king, because he served another king called Saul. He was the king at that time when David was young, and he was just a shepherd. And he actually used to work for Saul. And Saul, he used to play his harp when the king used to get troubled. David played his harp and it would calm the king down. So that's the backstory. You find the story of David and Goliath. This is Mrs. Salloway's Bible, in a book in the Bible called Samuel. And it's quite near the front. It's in what you call the Old Testament, so it's not in the New Testament, it's in the Old Testament. It's a really, really, really amazing story. So let's read the story now. So it's a really exciting story. If you can see Goliath there. So let's talk about this story. Goliath was big. He had to stoop to get through doorways. His head was always bumping up against the ceiling. And his friends thought twice before inviting him for dinner. Goliath had a big spear, 10 feet long at least, with a big iron point, and his big bronze armour weighed 100 pounds or more. Goliath had a really big voice too, and he was part of the army, of the Philistines. And the Philistines were enemies of the Israelites. And that's where David's family came from the family of the Israelites. And both sides were going to fight. And they were at a valley. And they were both standing on top of the hills. And they were waiting. Goliath stood in the valley waiting for somebody to come and fight him. Goliath stamped out in front of the army and shouted across the valley to the soldiers camped on the other side, "I am Goliath, and I dare any of you to come and fight me. Win the fight, and we will be your slaves. Lose, and you must work for us." Now David, he was just a shepherd, and he was little. He was just a boy, really, who looked after sheep. When he wanted to break from that, often he was asked to carry cheese and bread to these brothers who were fighting the Philistines. Okay? And that's what he was doing one day when he heard Goliath shouting. David was a little angry. "Who does this giant think he is?" huffed David. "Doesn't he know that the Lord God himself watches over us? Why, with God's help, even I can beat a bully." So David took a little walk and he went to see the king. "I want to fight the giant," he announced. The king almost fell off his throne. "But you are so little, David. You can't fight him. He's so big and you're so small." This was David's reply. "A lion is big and so is a bear. But when they come after my sheep, the Lord God helped me face them and I fight them off. He will do the same with this giant." "All right," the king agreed, "but at least let me lend you my armour." The armour was big and it was very, very heavy. Can you imagine wearing armour that doesn't fit? Especially in them days, because the armour was really, really heavy. So David said, "I can't fight in that. I can hardly walk. I must give it you back." So David took the armour off and he just went out towards Goliath and he picked up 5 little stones and a sling and his trusty shepherd's staff. Goliath gave a big laugh. "Ho, ho, 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 ho." He saw the little boy coming and he took 2 big steps. 2 more giant steps for Goliath, and David ran a little further. They were in the middle of the valley now and everything was quiet. Goliath roared a big roar, sucked in a big breath of air and raised his big spear. "How do you think you're going to win me, David? Look at you, ho, 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 ho." And before the giant could say another word, a stone came rushing past. David had sneaked into his little hand. He put his hand into his pouch and pulled out a stone and slipped it in the sling. Then he spun it round his head and let it fly. The stone stuck right into the giant's head and Goliath fell with a thud to the ground. Everybody shouted, "Hooray, hooray, hooray!" Goliath sighed. The Philistines whispered, oh no, we've lost." And from then on, some pretty big things happened to little David. He was given a king's reward, and he was promised the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. And one day, as I said earlier, he became king himself, the very best king God's people had ever had. And that's the story about David and Goliath. And I'm just going to talk about what Christians believe the story means. So, basically, sometimes in life, we look at the outward appearance of somebody, don't we? So we often look at somebody, we can see that they're strong, or we can see all about them. We think that we know all about them just by looking at them. But Christians believe, and it says in the Bible, and this is what God says about David, that God doesn't always look at our outward appearance, but he looks inside of us, and he looks at our heart, which means he looks at our character. He looks to see if we're a good person. He looks to see if we're going to forgive when it's difficult. He looks to see if, we have the right, we think the right things. And that's not always easy, is it? I'm not saying this is easy, but God looks at our hearts. And even David, he made mistakes, and God can forgive us. But I don't know, but God had chosen David for this task, and he'd chosen David to be king. So even though people overlooked him, even his own family didn't realise that David would be the chosen one to be king. His brothers looked stronger and bigger, and they thought, definitely them, never David. But, as I say, God looks at our hearts, and that's what's important to God, not our outward appearance. And also, it's a story about how, Christians believe God uses very ordinary people to do amazing things. And that's like all of us, isn't it? We're all ordinary people, but we can all achieve great things, especially when we have our starfish and we do the right thing and we have the right character within us, like David. And and also sometimes we have to face difficult things, like David had to face Goliath, didn't he? And that was a difficult thing for him to face. And in life, like I said in one of my other assemblies on superhero strength, sometimes we come against problems, we come against difficult things that seem so big, so daunting. But Christians believe that in trouble that God can help us, and in those very, very difficult times that we can pray and God will help us and help us win, help us be successful even when things are difficult. So I know that we're still fighting the coronavirus, and it's a big giant, isn't it? Sometimes it's a big giant that we're facing, but we can get through this, and we can have that strength and that courage like David. David was a man of courage. He was brave, and I think really that's what we need to be right now. We need to be people of courage, we need to be people of bravery, don't we? To fight and to when I say fight, I don't mean literally fight. I mean to overcome obstacles. Okay. And I hope you've enjoyed that story about David and Goliath. I love the story of David. Maybe I can do a few more, because there's quite a few different stories in the Bible about David. So anyway, hope to see you soon, and take care. Thanks for listening. Bye.